Ever since the creation of the automobile, almost 100 years ago, man has been obsessed with trying to go faster, with the desire to build an ultimate sports car, a true classic, genuine thoroughbred that would leave its mark on our motoring heritage. Like this Ferrari Daytona Spider, which many think is the last of the great front-engine sports cars. These innovators, many of them now legendary names like Bugatti, Porsche, Ferrari, who stamped their imprint on sports car design, were assured of life membership of an elite club. Only they could lay claim to the creation of a classic sports car, a genuine thoroughbred. From the very beginning, man built cars to compete. Some did it better than others. 3/4 of a century later, man's passion for speed and racing is no less compulsive, but the means of transport is now that much more sophisticated and infinitely quicker. The development of the racing sports car can largely be traced through specific marks. Manufacturers who at one period in the history of the automobile have shown a total domination of road racing, particularly endurance events like the Mille Miglia, Targa Florio, and more importantly, Le Mans. It has been shown that the creation of a vehicle able to dominate any era of sports car racing and to carry the reputation of a true thoroughbred is usually the inspiration of one man devoted to a single purpose, a craftsman, an engineer, even a visionary. Such a genius was Ettore Bugatti. Although of Italian extraction and gaining early experience of the automobile industry in Germany, France was Bugatti's domain. And there in a small town called Molzin, he built a factory that would produce some of the most memorable racing and production machinery created between the First and Second World Wars. Ettore Bugatti's vision of the automobile was guided by his intuitive aesthetic sense. Everything must be simple and either rectangular or cylindrical. Moreover, parts like pistons and cylinder blocks were interchangeable, and this allowed him to design many models in 1 year. The result? Perfection, or as he would say, pur sang, pure blood. From his drawing board poured a cascade of designs. He made everything himself, bar the tires. He created the distinctive Bugatti horseshoe radiator, the hollow curved front axle, the famous aluminium alloy wheels, their method of casting a prized secret, the lightweight body held together with straps and safety wire. The core of Bugatti's philosophy lay in the statement, if I succeed in achieving what I'm looking for, it will be a car, a piece of machinery above all criticism. He attained that distinction with his unquestionable masterpiece, arguably the most successful road-going racing car of all time, achieving more than 2,000 victories, the Type 35.
Okay.
One tribute to Bugatti's original design philosophy is that a car like this Type 35, which is now more than 60 years old, and still retaining all its original components, is able to outrun many of the current production sports cars. In the 1920s, although Bugatti ruled on the road and track, Le Patron had numerous competitors, German, Italian, French and American, but none more different in approach than the very British engineer Walter Owen Bentley. W.O., as he was affectionately known, was a believer in strong automobiles. They must be rugged, reliable and practical, true to his own character and that of the nation he represented, and so loved. It all really started for Bentley at a race called Le Mans, a 24-hour endurance test around a 10-mile part dirt, part road circuit used several times for the French Grand Prix. It would prove the ultimate test for a car. And from the first race in 1923, it caught the imagination of the public and soon gained status within the motor industry. Bentley went on to win Le Mans outright a total of 5 times, a remarkable record for a small company with limited funds and humble beginnings. The memory of Bentley's racing achievements of the 1920s is kept alive today by Rolls-Royce, who manufacture a model appropriately called the Bentley Mulsanne Turbo, so named after the famous high-speed straight at Le Mans. W.O. Bentley was first and foremost an engine man. That took all his attention and energy. And his production models that financed his racing exploits soon became dated, lacking some of the flair and innovations of their competitors. So the customers disappeared, and W.O. was forced to sell his company to Rolls-Royce. But the legacy that Bentley left behind is just as strong today as it was 50 years ago. The Marque's character and overwhelming sense of power and strength is perhaps best captured by this legendary model, the supercharged Bentley, always known as the Blower. 4.5-litre racer, perhaps the best-known Bentley of them all, and the direct inspiration of the Mulsanne Turbo of the 1980s. This majestic 2-ton dinosaur, commissioned by wealthy sportsman Sir Henry Birkin, who was then the premier British racing driver of his time, caused Ettore Bugatti to remark at the 1929 French Grand Prix, Monsieur Bentley makes the fastest trucks in Europe, which, while sounding like the ultimate put-down, was in fact for Bugatti quite a compliment, because he scarcely ever admitted that his rivals even existed. Now, to pilot this definitive sports racer is a driver who's won many historic races, including 2 at Le Mans, Willie Green. All right, Willie? Right. From the day Bentley lost his company to Rolls-Royce in the early 30s, the mystique of the Marque slowly grew, eventually attaining the legendary status it holds today. It was part of W.O.'s modesty that he could never understand why the Marque he created had such a unique character and became the first true British thoroughbred sports car. Il numero primo de automobili d'Italia, dashing, proud, and potent. Alfa Romeo, which prior to the Second World War was the soul of Italy, and a total contrast to the somewhat oversized and less than nimble Bentleys. This was a beginning of a new era in sports car design, light, functional, and very quick. Few marques were to dominate an era so conclusively as Alfa Romeo did the 1930s. They won every major classic road race from the Mille Miglia to Le Mans, year after year, and were to dominate the Targa Florio and Grand Prix racing as well. In that decade, they built an international reputation of such prestige that even today, the name Alfa Romeo conjures up a certain excitement. A driver who has a special understanding and affinity for the marque is 3 times outright winner of Le Mans, Derek Bell.
Oh, what a car. Having been a member of the 1975 Works Alfa Romeo team and having helped them win the World Sports Car Championship in that year, which in fact was the last time that they ever won a World Sports Car Championship, it's even more remarkable to think that we have a car that was built over half a century ago, and I'm fortunate enough to drive it today. This, in fact, is the 1931 Mille Miglia Alfa Romeo. Italian cars, they always seem to have this very elegant flair for design. Even though perhaps some of the geometry and the suspension work is a little bit crude, it still shows and it still proves to me that it's an Italian car, and there's just something very special about driving these cars.
2 men were generally considered to have been the inspiration behind the creation of the marque of Alfa Romeo as we know it today, Nicola Romeo and Vittorio Jano. It wasn't until after the First World War that Signor Romeo revealed an increased enthusiasm for cars and racing. He went in search of a new designer for his company, and together with his racing consultant, one Enzo Ferrari, found the young engineer Vittorio Jano at Fiat and put him in charge of all future design and development. And in a very short time began the first of the great run of Jano Alfa Romeo classics. Jano built his automobiles with the same passion that a great sculptor puts into his marble. And a noted journalist of the time wrote, "The mechanical perfection of Jano's cars surpasses even that of Le Patron, Ettore Bugatti." Jano understood harmony and balance, and he was the first to realize that anything that was of use on a racing car could, if applied properly, be equally useful on a production car. And by so doing, Jano created important links between the racing and the road-going car. He forged the ties between the track and the production line by innovative design and construction. To appraise one of the classic Jano Alfas, the actual 1931 Le Mans winner is the most successful driver the race has ever produced. 6 times outright winner, Jackie Ickx.
Well, 50 years ago, this was the ultimate sports racing car. The Alfa Romeo 2.3-liter supercharged. It won nearly every major race in the early 1930s. This car was largely responsible for creating the Alfa Romeo legend of fast, well-handling sport car. This is still a very special car to drive. Delicate, precise, and fast. And this is the ultimate sport racing car of the 1980s. It is the Rotman's Porsche 956.
It was in a Porsche that Jackie Ickx achieved 5 of his 6 Le Mans successes in 74, 76, 77, 81 and 82. The continued success of the 956 during the 80s made the Porsche the premier sports racer of that decade. 60 years ago, another domination was already underway. Alfa Romeo would eventually submit to the better financed Teutonic rivals of Auto Union and particularly Mercedes. Adolf Hitler wanted German supremacy on the Grand Prix circuits of the world, regardless of cost, and he achieved it. Since the turn of the century, the three-pointed star has been a force in the automobile industry and racing. Mercedes, the inspiration of Gottlieb Daimler and his partner Wilhelm Maybach, two German engineers largely credited with producing the first automobile in 1886. They christened one of their models Mercedes, after the daughter of a business colleague, and the name caught on. Around the same period, another German engineer, Carl Benz, was to manufacture the world's first production car, the Benz. Into the 20th century, the marques of Daimler and Benz were into racing, achieving considerable success and helping the reputation of both companies to quick expansion. It wasn't until 1926 that the Daimler and the Benz companies merged to form Daimler-Benz, still retaining the Mercedes name. They employed as their senior engineer a certain Ferdinand Porsche. At that time, he was regarded as a highly talented man in the forefront of automotive design. But nobody could foresee that he would go on to leave probably the widest-ranging legacy of any of the motoring pioneers of the 20th century. It was Porsche who created torsion bar suspension, the 16-cylinder Auto Union Grand Prix car, the Tiger tank, and his master achievement, the original Volkswagen Beetle. And with his son, Ferry, he was the inspiration behind the Porsche sports car. But one of his earlier achievements was the range of sports cars he helped create for Mercedes. Nowadays, racing and the automobile industry are obsessed with turbocharging. Well over half a century ago, it was Ferdinand Porsche who was largely responsible for the development of supercharging, from which turbocharging evolved. And this is one of the first cars to embody that development, the classic Mercedes SSK of the late 1920s. 7.1 litres, developing a reputed 300 horsepower. This thunderous machine was among the fastest sports cars of its day, with a top speed close to 130 miles an hour. The SSK needed a strong-willed driver to tame it. Today, it's a rare sight to see an original SSK Mercedes like this pristine example in action. Only a mere handful still exist, and they're now so sought after that their value is impossible to calculate. The position of dominance held by Mercedes in motor racing in the late 30s was suddenly dashed by the outbreak of the Second World War. But the three-pointed star was to return. To understand a Ferrari, you must listen. The engine speaks. 12 cylinders, 300 horsepower, smooth as silk, violent on request. In fact, just like its maker. High-spirited, self-propelled, and very determined. Enzo Ferrari has created some of the fastest and most beautiful cars ever made, and won more Grand Prix and World Championship titles than any other marque. A man of volcanic temper and used to having his own way. An autocrat, a czar, a dictator even, but an unqualified genius. Born on the 18th of February, 1898, on the outskirts of Modena, Italy, the young Enzo Ferrari had ambitions to be an opera singer and a racing driver. As he had no ear for music, it was the second choice that dominated his life. He had moderate success as a works driver for Alfa Romeo, but came to realize his talent was best suited to working behind the scenes, which he did with Alfa until 1929, before setting out to run his own team, Scuderia Ferrari. After a fierce struggle and battling the post-war depression, he survived to produce the first Ferrari car in 1947. Ferrari was obsessed with 12-cylinder engines. He loved their intricacy and sound. Not the ripping canvas exhaust of a Bugatti or the rasp of the Alfa, but a cry all of its own. With dramatic, fire-breathing racers like this 275 LM, Ferrari vanquished Alfa Romeo, his former employers, in the field, and from the early 1950s, his red racers would challenge all comers in the greatest ever decade of sports car racing, innovation, and design. Nothing illustrates Ferrari's sports car style of the 50s better than the legendary Testarossa. Exotic looking, innovative, competitive, and powered by one of the best engines of the era, that silk-smooth, light alloy V12. Complete the combination, a master driver who understood Ferrari and his cars as well as any man who was ever contracted to the works team. A man who brought Ferrari a world championship, former world motorcycle and drivers champion, John Surtees.
The whole awe of producing a machine in Maranello was something where, obviously, it was mainly stimulated by the old man himself, Enzo Ferrari. At times, I know he's even turned down designs because they didn't really look fierce enough. They had to look right and look the part, which is, of course, very Italian. And this is why, apart from the fact of the actual design and the aesthetics, there's also that tremendous sound from Ferrari. Derek, let's see if they're as good as they used to be.
Let's see if you're as good as you used to be.
Well, let's go.
Okay.
To many, the most complete Ferrari of them all is the very last of the front-engine sports racers, now a sought-after collector's classic and immensely valuable, the GTO. Dueling here are examples of the first and last GTOs produced in the model's short but spectacular lifespan. This car helped win for Ferrari the World Sports Car Championship for 3 consecutive years in the early 60s and conclusively confirmed Enzo Ferrari's genius. Professional racing driver to be asked personally by Enzo Ferrari to drive for his works team is a supreme compliment. Very few ever have the opportunity. John Surtees and Derek Bell were both such contract drivers. They recall their first impressions of Il Commendatore.
And suddenly the old man walked up towards me with one of his smaller secretaries beside him with his white mac on over his shoulders, you know, and this sort of white hair he had and the dark glasses. I'll never forget the secretary said to me, who was with me, said, El Commendatore is the one on the right.
Yes.
You know, it's so funny, really. But did you ever meet him sort of in that situation, or you got summoned, I suppose?
I'd seen him, I'd never seen a car race except one when I sort of started car racing. That was that I was motorcycling. I'd seen him at Monza once, and never to really speak to, but I'd seen him there. And then when it became rumoured that I would sort of change from bikes over to cars, I had 2 or 3 drives in a Lotus and a Cooper. And then I had a call. Come and see Mr. Ferrari. And I went off to Modena, and then they sort of took me out to Maranello, and I was shown in to see the old man. And he was sitting there in a desk with a picture of his son, Dino,
right,
just behind there. And nothing else much, and quite stark. And he sort of said, would you like to drive for us? And I said, oh, well, one moment. You know, I'm just starting.
That's right, straight out of bikes.
It's early, let me see. He said, well, think about it. Show you in the factory. And so
John Surtees did, of course, eventually sign for Enzo Ferrari and went on to win the World Drivers' Championship for the team.
And I met Keaty, who was the engineer there.
When this car was launched on Austerity Britain in September 1949, at under £1,000, it created a sensation. The Jaguar XK120, with a top speed in excess of 120 miles an hour, which is why it was called the 120, and a streamlined body of exquisite proportion and design for the period. This car not only outpaced Aston Martin and Fraser-Nash, but it was a fraction of the cost. Jaguar had arrived and the world took note. As a publicity stunt, Jaguar Cars asked a certain Stirling Moss to drive the XK120 for 24 hours at Mont-Léry, where it averaged 107 miles an hour. And so successful was this exercise that the factory then decided to tackle Le Mans. Le Mans was the making of Jaguar. First, a special racing version of the XK120. Then came the C-Type, an outright prototype racer with its newly invented disc brakes, which took the first 2 places in 1953. And the following year, Jaguar's masterpiece, the D-Type. The D-Type was a breakthrough sports car, dashing, innovative, but also highly practical. It won Le Mans in 3 consecutive years in the mid-50s for Jaguar, knocking out the best from Ferrari and Aston Martin. In that glorious decade, the British rode high, and Jaguar became established in the minds of the average motorist as the working man's supercar. Jaguar was very much the creation of Englishman William Lyons, an entrepreneur with a keen sense of design and public taste. He started making sidecars for motorcycles after the First World War, then went on to produce sporting bodies for a version of the famous Austin 7. Finally building his own cars and breaking more and more new ground until the birth of the XK120. As dramatically as William Lyons had arrived on the racing scene, so suddenly he withdrew, announcing that the enormous cost was no longer reflected in the sales of their production cars. To the end, Lyons was the astute entrepreneur. But before selling out to the government-owned British Leyland, he was to produce one last spectacular masterstroke. A machine which probably made a bigger impact on the public at its launch in 1961 than any other sports car before or since. The E-Type. First, the shape, it looked the part, dramatic, streamlined, sensual, a direct development of the racing D-Type. Second, it cost only just over £2,000, substantially less than the equivalent Ferraris, Aston Martins, Maseratis. Thirdly, it was very quick, topping 150 miles an hour. This was the car which was to carry the Jaguar flag for the next 15 years, and it's a car which, to this day, has never really been replaced. Though not as a sports production model, Jaguar was, however, to re-emerge in the late 80s as a Le Mans challenger to the then dominant Porsche team. As it was back in Walter Owen Bentley's day, so it is now. The concept of the race is for automobile manufacturers to compete against each other over 24 hours to decide the best sports car of the day. Much has changed since that first endurance event in 1923, and today's leading prototype racers bear little resemblance to the current sports cars that are available to you and me to drive on the open highway. Despite considerable changes to that original concept, the appeal to the public and the automobile manufacturers has not. Millions are still spent each year to create the Le Mans racer capable of taking outright victory. The 1988 Le Mans Classic was an emotive race. Jaguar, then part of a newly structured British car industry, came in force to try and stop Porsche taking their 8th consecutive outright victory. Worldwide prestige and lucrative production car sales were at stake. During practice, the Porsches are in command, eclipsing the lap record, but the actual race will be different. Their speed advantage will be heavily blunted. Jaguar, with their 5-car assault of 7-litre V12s, hound the 3 red and yellow turbocharged works Porsches. This is a duel between two manufacturers with contrasting technical philosophies. The large, normally aspirated engines of the Jaguars versus the smaller turbo units of the Porsches. The Jaguars are heavy, but are less thirsty on full song. With a total fuel limit for the 24 hours of 2,550 litres, the faster Porsches must keep their turbo boost down to conserve fuel. The Jaguars are thus able to compete on an equal footing. It makes for a fascinating contrast. Two major international manufacturers taking a totally different approach and proving to be on equal terms on the track, looking for the ultimate Le Mans equation. By 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, June the 12th, Jaguar number 2 crosses the finishing line less than a lap ahead of the leading Porsche. The big cats are back, victorious at Le Mans, which they last won 31 years before. The British contingent of over 50,000 are ecstatic. Jaguar have returned, and once again, the Circuit de la Sarthe has staged a race worthy of the Le Mans legend.
And of course, especially to the drivers, Jan Lammers, Andy Wallace, and Tony Dumfries. Great race, 7th victory for Jaguar here in Le Mans.
Throughout the 1950s, another British marque with a long racing heritage, Aston Martin, had been fighting to break out from under the shadow of Jaguar. Manufacturers of hand-built sports cars in the traditional English way, Aston Martin, like Jaguar, saw racing as a way to improve sales of their production models. For a glorious moment in 1959, Aston Martin created one of the most complete sports cars of the decade. That year it won Le Mans outright and the World Championship. It was known as the DBR-1, named after the company's then owner and benefactor, David Brown. The car was as aesthetically complete as anything Jaguar or Ferrari had yet produced, and today ranks as one of the most sought-after post-war prototype racing sports cars. In the 1950s, the great decade of sports car innovation and design, one driver was unique in having raced all the leading cars of the era. All the great marques at their prime, and won with each of them, Ferrari being the only exception. That driver is today one of the genuine legends of the sport, Stirling Moss.
Fantastic. You know, it's just on 25 years since I drove this car, and she's just as good as I remember. Superb to handle. Most responsive, handle, you can place her on the throttle and everything, and a true road racing car. A car that was built actually for circuits like Nürburgring, and actually this is a bit like Nürburgring, absolutely sensational. The car was probably the finest road racing car of its time. It did win the World Championship, and it was absolutely beautiful to drive, and it's just as good now. Well, now over here, here's another very beautiful car, which I have fond memories of. This was actually the first car in the world ever to win a race with disc brakes. I think it was June of 1951, actually, when the C-Type Jag raced at Reims, and I was lucky enough to be driving it then. Absolutely fabulous car, an even better road racing car probably than the D-Type, which of course was its younger brother. But this car was brought up on roads as against Le Mans only, although of course we did race at Le Mans, and I think I got the fastest lap with it one year. Well, here is what must be the most famous Jaguar of all, of course, the D-Type, a three-time winner of Le Mans, and a fantastic machine. I can tell you this car will do about 170 or more, and I remember in 1954, I think, when I was part of the team, going along to the scrutineering, we had three cars, then, of course, they were green. This is a blue one from Écosse, but the three cars, and I felt terribly proud to be the driver of one of these cars. Very, very aerodynamically stable, perfect brakes, because by the time the D-Type came, we'd sorted out the problems of the C-Type brakes. Fantastic machine. Well, the Maserati 300S, probably my favorite car for just the fun of driving. Italian car, didn't have the brakes of the English cars, of course, because they were drums, but it handled extremely well, probably as good as the DBR1, and that's saying something. I can tell you that I raced this car, I think, in the Nürburgring 1,000 kilometers, was lucky enough to win that, and also the Caracas or Venezuelan Grand Prix. Well, I think probably the greatest car of that era, and a fabulous era it was, the 50s for sports cars, was the Mercedes 300 SLR. A car that I'm glad to say I was connected with in winning the Mille Miglia, the Targa Florio, and the TT, and of course it gave Mercedes the World Championship of sports cars, but that car was fantastic. It wasn't as easy to drive as some of the other ones, but it was always reliable. You knew that if you finished a race, you were either second to Fangio or you won it. It was that reliable.
In 1955, Mercedes were once again at the pinnacle of their racing success, having retrenched after the Second World War and recently made a spectacular comeback. Supreme in sports car and Grand Prix racing, they won both championships in 1955. And then came that tragedy at Le Mans when one of their magnesium-bodied racers catapulted into the crowd, killing 80 people. At the end of the 1955 season, Mercedes withdrew from racing completely. They were not to return to the track for 35 years. Just as Jaguar were to accomplish with their E-Type before bowing out of the sports car arena, so Mercedes would leave behind one of the most charismatic production models ever built. Now, definitive, rare, and immensely valuable, this would be the last genuine Mercedes production sports car, the 300 SL. Few cars of its time could match it for outright pace or innovation. Mercedes had their own style and method. Fuel injection, 150-mile-an-hour top speed. Adjustable driving wheel for awkward legs. In fact, a model of Teutonic thoroughness and precision. First, we activate the fuel pump. Then engage first gear. Oh, it's down periscope. Following Jaguar's successful return to sports car racing, which was crowned by their Le Mans win in 1988, Mercedes re-emerged from self-imposed exile to re-establish their claim to be the purveyors of high-performance cars of exquisitely engineered excellence. The cars and team had lost none of their legendary discipline and reliability. In 1989, their C9 Sauber Mercedes emulated Jaguar's 1988 achievement by taking victory outright, claiming the first two places and winning the overall team award. The Mercedes race statistics are impressive. Their cars deliver 730 horsepower and are capable of a top speed of 220 miles an hour. The race distance covered is a little over 3,100 miles. This necessitates 30 refueling stops and 120 tyre changes per car, 14,000 gear changes and 8 million crankshaft revolutions. The water pump volume throughput of a single car is 3 million litres, the equivalent to the contents of 9,000 bathtubs. In the early 60s, with Mercedes, Jaguar, Aston Martin, Maserati all retired as factory teams, Ferrari were left unchallenged to dominate sports car racing. They won Le Mans 5 times in a row, often taking the first 6 places. Records show that the first competition won by a Porsche took place on the 11th of July 1948 with a class victory in a race around the houses of Innsbruck in Austria. And the car was the prototype 356, an open-bodied mid-engine two-seater, much like this car. In fact, this is the first Porsche ever made. It's known as number 1. Now, it's interesting to note that Enzo Ferrari, Porsche's biggest rival for world sports car supremacy in the years to come, had his first victory in that very same year, 1948. These small-engine silver bugs, as they were to become known, started to contest the index of performance prizes in the small-engine categories, 1100 and 1300 cc, and discreetly vanquished all opposition, coming to the notice of the sport and the customer alike. By now, Ferry Porsche, Professor Ferdinand's son, was the driving force of the Porsche company, and it was he who decided to build a proper sports racer. That car was the 550 Spider, preying on creatures twice its size. This model was the seed from which all subsequent Porsche racing success was to stem. It was offered to paying customers, who discovered its reliability and simplicity of maintenance. But more important, they found it won races. By the end of the 50s, the Spider had established an outright record as one of the most successful prototype sports racers ever. Every 10 years, Porsche would compute their scores of victories, amass huge amounts of technical data, and plan for the next 10 years. A gradual program of development which saw their racing sports cars grow in stature, size, and achievement. In the 1950s, it was the generation of the Spider and the 4-cylinder engine. And then the 60s heralded 6-cylinder machines and the more powerful 8-cylinder units. And then eventually came 12 cylinders. And the car which gave Porsche outright victory at Le Mans after so many class victories, the 917. Perhaps typically, having mastered the 12-cylinder engine, Porsche reverted to 6 cylinders again, but now turbocharged. And with this car, the 936, won Le Mans outright 3 times. The Porsche 956, the quickest of them all. The most successful prototype racer of the 1980s, and the definitive Le Mans challenger. Designing a car to tackle the major endurance races of today's World Sports Car Championships has become an exact science. The car has to be able to combine 3 vital elements. It must have outright pace, with an ability to reach top speeds in excess of 230 miles per hour on circuits like Le Mans, and be able to run trouble-free at those speeds for up to 24 hours, and to race on a limited allocation of fuel specified by the regulations. The delicate balance of these 3 elements is what the Porsche design team had to master. In the 80s, this took place on the drawing board and then on the racetrack. But now car design and development is born of the computer. Structures, materials, weight configurations, engine output and performance dynamics are all subjected to mathematical scrutiny and analysis on the computer simulator and in the wind tunnel, and seemingly tested to destruction long before the realities of the test track and racetrack are addressed. Mazda's Le Mans Challenge started with the appearance in 1974 of the Sigma MC74 Rotary. This appearance heralded the debut of a Japanese car. There then followed 15 years of investment in time, development and money that led to eventual victory in 1991 with their unique rotary-powered engine car, the 767B, seen here in the red, green and silver livery of Charge. Mazda are proud to have beaten their Japanese rivals to join the ranks of the great European Le Mans legends. Many of the originators and the innovators and the engineers who inspired the great marques of sports car design over the past 80 years are gone, huh? But though the legend of many of these great marques still lives on, control now rests mainly not with a single inspired visionary, but with the conglomerates and the multinational corporations. And one cannot help feeling that it was the vision of one passionate, dedicated man that gave the true thoroughbred its special quality in the first place. Ultimately, mass production and vast turnover do not seem to produce the ultimate sports car. Those creations that lift the spirit and cause the blood to race and transcend the ordinary into greatness. And what are the new generation of sports cars, the sophisticated products of this new age? Will we talk of the Mazda MX-6, the Nissan 300ZX, the Toyota GTP, and the Honda NSX with the affection and respect that we reserve for the Bugatti and Alfa Romeo? Likewise, the Ferrari F40 and the Jaguar XJR15, until recently the prodigal sons of the corporate industrial state, but now safe within the fold of the multinational complexes, Ferrari with Fiat and Jaguar with Ford. Will they retain their aura of daring and wonder and continue to command our respect, or has something gone forever? On that point, I would reserve judgment, and I suspect that the jury, which is still out, will be out for a long time to come.